Welcome back, guys. Today we're going to continue talking about World War II, and we're going to talk about D-Day. Now, D-Day is one of the most famous days in the World War II for Americans. Why is that? Well, this is the day that the United States and Canada and England invaded France on June 6, 1944, and began to push the Germans back once and for all. And so we look at this first slide, and we can see at the very top Stalin, the chairman of the Communist Party of Russia during World War II. He's asking England and the United States and Canada for a Western Front because Germany is fighting mostly in the east against the Russians, and the Russians lose 20 million people during this war. And so Stalin is saying, please open up, let's fight Germany on two sides, just like ultimately we almost do in Japan in 1945. Stalin is asking to fight Germany on the Western Front. And so the United States do that, and they agree to a Europe first strategy, meaning they're not going to defeat Japan first, focus on Europe. So in November 1942, the United States invades North Africa from the south. They come into North Africa, and then from North Africa, by September of 1943, they move north into southern Europe, into Italy. They take Italy out of the war, and by July of 1943, Germany is retreating back from Russia on the Eastern Front. And by June of 1944, from D-Day, Germany is retreating from the Western Front. So Germany is retreating, and it's getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And the Russians over here, and the Americans and French and British and Canadians, French resistance anyway, over on the western side, and they're pushing Germany. So if you look at this next slide, let's talk about D-Day. Now, President Eisenhower is the commander-in-chief of the Allied, he's the supreme commander of the Allied forces in Europe. And he has to plan an invasion, and we're going to see a map in just a moment of where he's planning that invasion. He's going to plan this invasion to invade France, and he's going to work with Canada and England to do that. And he's got to figure out a way to do this at night, but he has to see, so he has to plan it during a full moon when the moon is big. He also has to plan when the ocean goes out and comes in, he has to plan it when it's low, because if the boats come in, he wants the ocean to go up. If the boats come in and the tide comes down, the boats will get stuck. So he wants to plan it when it's a low tide, so as the tide comes up, the boats will more easily be able to drop their soldiers and then back away. Of course, it has to be a complete secret. Even the soldiers didn't know. Even on the morning when they go to fight in France, they don't know exactly where they're going. They know they're going to France, but they don't know which beaches they're going to. So D-Day is called Operation Overlord. Now what you see on this next slide is Operation Bodyguard. Now Operation Bodyguard is a fake invasion that the Americans plan in Scotland. And they talk on the radio in a code that they know the Germans have broken. And they talk in this code about an invasion of Norway and of northern France. And troops begin to mass, not too many, but troops begin to mass in Scotland. They prepare to join the Soviets in an invasion of Europe from the north. And they begin to post wedding announcements in the newspaper in Scotland of Americans marrying Scottish girls. For German airplanes that fly over, they lay fake tank tracks in the ground. And they have these inflatable, means they're filled with air, tanks that from the air look like real tanks. And they begin massing these things that from the air and from the radio look like an invasion is coming from northern France. And they begin to fly out into the ocean, and they will throw out aluminum pieces, massive pieces of aluminum, because the German radar will pick up these aluminum pieces, and the Germans think that there's a massive amount of airplanes flying through the air, when really it's one airplane dropping pieces of metal. So this is this Operation Bodyguard is a big thing. Now D-Day is Operation Overlord, and we can look at the next slide, and this takes place on June 6, 1944. The Canadians, the British, and the American. There's 5 beaches that they're going to attack. The American has Utah Beach and Omaha. The British have Sword and Gold beaches. The Canadians have Juno Beach. And there's heavy fighting on some of these. Now, what you can see from the map that we have on the next slide is you can see about where these are. And around just south and west of Le Havre on this beach. Now, if you're Hitler, you're guessing, where is this invasion going to take place? And Hitler thinks the invasion is going to take place right there where England and France are close, because that's where the northern invasion in Scotland is. That's the radio chatter. That's the Operation Bodyguard, the fake invasion. And so Hitler thinks it's going to come a little bit further north in Calais, but General Eisenhower is planning this around Le Havre and Cannes and west of Cannes. And so we're going to see another map here, but you can look at this next page and this next slide, and you can see on this next slide these beaches. Imagine if you have to invade these beaches. The Germans have concrete bunkers set up on these beaches and big machine guns. And so if men have to run onto these beaches, climb these cliffs, and then take these big concrete bunkers, it's very, very difficult. And Eisenhower knows it's very difficult. And so Eisenhower expects 90% casualties. He expects 90% of his soldiers to be killed or wounded. If we look at the next slide, we can see a picture of one of these beaches, and it's not a cliff from where this picture is taken, but still, you're coming in from the open ocean, and on the left side of the picture, the Germans will have bunkers set up to use machine guns and to take you out. And here's a picture on the next slide of some of these bunkers. Now, if you can imagine, as a soldier running from a boat across a beach, trying to take this bunker, as an American, British, or Canadian soldier trying to take this German bunker, it took a lot of courage. I'm sure many men died. It was very scary. So the next slide, we see D-Day. Well, what does D stand for in D-Day? It's just day. It doesn't mean anything. And H hour is the hour that we start. It's just our hour. It just doesn't make any sense, but that's what it is. So it begins with an air assault about early in the morning, and there's paratroopers, men that jump out of the airplanes with a parachute. And they have gliders that have no engines, airplanes with no engines, and they kind of glide in gently. And then they begin, after the paratroopers drop in, then the ships come in with the soldiers and with this amphibious and sea assault. And then you begin with the airplanes bombing everywhere in Germany, in France that they can find, to any targets that they can see. So Hitler, remember, believes that this invasion is taking place in the north, in Calais, and so he will not release his soldiers, and he will not release his tanks and airplanes to fight in the south. He thinks it's going to come in the north, and he thinks it's just a small diversion, a small side attack, but in fact, it's the real attack on D-Day. On this next slide, you can see where the Americans and the Canadians and the British left from, and you can see the beaches that they landed on. On the next slide, you can see a little bit better which beaches were the Americans from left to right. Utah, Omaha, and then we have the British beach of Gold, and then Canadian is Juno, and then finally a British beach is Sword Beach. And some of these saw very heavy fighting, and one or two of them didn't see heavy fighting. It was light fighting. This air assault was the 82nd Airborne and the 101st Airborne. 13,000 men jumped out of airplanes with parachutes. They began to jump about 1:30, 2 o'clock in the morning, and they jumped out in what's called a stick formation. So the first man that jumps out, when he lands on the ground, he'll walk forward. The last man that jumps out, when he lands on the ground, he'll turn around and walk backwards. And so the idea is that all the men can kind of work towards each other. But remember, there's 13,000 men jumping out of airplanes that are tightly connected together, and it's dark and they don't know where they're at, and they cannot be loud, because if they're loud, the Germans will hear them or find them. And so it was chaos. No one knew whose unit they were in. No one knew who the commanding officer was. And some of these men died because it had been heavy rains in France during this period in April and May. and there was still, there was still flooding in some areas. So the men landed with these heavy backpacks, and some of them drowned because they landed in pools of water that were very deep. And you can see on this next page, we can see this next slide, we see a picture of a glider. The nose of that glider opens up and a tank can roll out, and so it carries heavy equipment. Now remember, the glider doesn't have an engine, and so it's pulled by an airplane that does have an engine by a rope. And then when they're way up in the air, then the rope will drop, and the glider then flies on into France, and it's quiet, it's not heard, and it lands on the ground. And so that was the goal of the glider. Now on the next page you can see a crashed airplane in France on D-Day, because remember, they can't see where they're going and they don't have their lights on. And this is not a glider, this is an airplane, and this crashes and men are killed. On this next slide we can see, again, we just kind of see the invasion map, and if you were to pause the video, you can see how far they got on D+1, which is 1 day after D-Day. D+2 is 2 days after D-Day. D+3, 4, and so on. They slowly began to push their way into France and push the Germans back. Now, France doesn't have an army at this point because they're controlled by Germany. And so everyone we're fighting is German. And the French are on our side. The French are, hooray, they're trying to make us and help us win. But look at this next slide, and I want you to imagine if this is you and you know you're about to land on these beaches. You're on this boat, and when that front of that boat just kind of drops down and you have to run off that boat, and you've got a machine gun and you can hear it coming, you can hear the Germans, and you can hear the explosions and you can see smoke. How hard is it for you to get off that boat? Are you brave? Can you do it? You're 18, 20, 25 years old. These kids are young. They're very young. And it was very hard, and many of them died. And you can see on this next slide, men actually running off of the boat, wading onto shore, fighting, getting ready to fight the Germans. And look at the next slide. There's a man in the water, and this is they actually had a photographer there on D-Day taking pictures of the photographs, taking pictures of the invasion. Most of his photographs, unfortunately, were ruined. Some of them survived, and this is one of them. A soldier laying down there in the water, fighting, climbing ashore on D-Day. And the first place that the Americans made progress, if you can look at the next slide, and it's now color, and at very far right, there's this point. It's called Pointe du Hoc, and the Army Rangers landed on this beach. They climbed up the cliff, and there's a bunker at the end of that cliff, and they ran into that bunker and threw in hand grenades and machine guns, and they killed the Germans, and they were able then to make their way forwards. And this is the first foothold that the Americans have on D-Day. And if we look at the next slide, we can see look at the pock marks on the landscape, and this is also Pointe du Hoc. And this is a result of aerial bombardment that the United States did as the invasion is taking place. So I don't think I would have wanted to be on this beach in Normandy, France on D-Day in June 6, 1944. Overall, 160,000 men crossed over the Channel on June 6 as part of D-Day, and Eisenhower expected 90% of them to be killed or wounded, and maybe half of them actually killed. 5,000 ships and boats, most of them made multiple crossings going back and forth and back and forth. 14,000 paratroopers, 2,500 of them were casualties. Just under 8,000 planes were as part of this invasion. 10,000, looking at the next slide, there's 10,000 Allied casualties. So out of the 160,000, not 90%, not even 10%, 10,000 of them were casualties, and about 4,400 died. 1,000 Germans dead, 3,000 French civilians died. It's the largest invasion and force in history on a single day, ever in the history. German invasion of Soviet Union was larger, perhaps 3.9 or 4 million troops, and that was on land. So D-Day was from ocean to land. So this is the largest single sea to land invasion in history on a single day. On the next slide, we see a cemetery, and this is the American cemetery in France. And this is all the men that were killed in D-Day. They're buried here on this beach in Normandy, in France. And if you go to France, you should visit this cemetery. And it's a very moving experience. There's also a Chinese cemetery in France, not in the same place. It's a different part of France. And that's World War I, not World War II. So, all right. So in the next lesson, we're going to continue talking about World War II and the end of World War II. All right. We'll see you guys then. Have a good one. Bye-bye.